Are you grappling with, persistent fatigue, or maybe that mysterious brain fog, weight that just refuses to budge, or perhaps you're worried about your family history, heart disease, maybe fertility struggles? What if all these seemingly separate health challenges actually shared a single hidden root cause? Today we're doing a deep dive into Dr. Benjamin Bikman's really eye-opening book, Why We Get Sick: The Hidden Epidemic at the Root of Host Chronic Disease and How to Fight It.
Exactly. And our mission here is really to unpack Dr. Bikman's, well, surprising truth that this common, often completely overlooked health condition might be quietly undermining your well-being and contributing to a huge range of chronic diseases. We'll explore what it is, why it's become so widespread, and most importantly, what you can actually do about it, starting right now.
Right. What if a really fundamental misunderstanding about our health has been keeping us from seeing the real problem? What if a condition you might not even know you have is behind so many of the health issues we face today?
Okay, let's unpack this. So, our journey really starts with understanding this hidden epidemic because, as Dr. Bikman reveals, it's far more common than most of us think.
Yeah, at its core, we're talking about insulin resistance, or IR, you'll hear it called. Simply put, it's a state where certain cells in your body, they start needing more insulin than they normally would to get the same job done. So this means your body ends up pumping out higher levels of insulin than it should be, and crucially, that insulin isn't working as well as it used to. Think of it like your cells are becoming kind of deaf to insulin signals. And what I found truly just astounding in Dr. Bikman's work was his point that insulin resistance isn't some rare thing. It's quietly become the most common health disorder worldwide, affecting more people, adults and children each year than any other single condition. Globally, cases have doubled in the last 30 years. Doubled. And they're expected to double again in less than 20 more. But here in the U.S., that statistic is even more, well, staggering. Maybe as many as 85 to 88% of American adults could be insulin resistant. It's almost everywhere.
It really flips the script on how we've typically thought about chronic disease, doesn't it? I mean, for decades, the focus has been squarely on high blood glucose, blood sugar, as the main alarm bell for diabetes. But Dr. Bikman, he really emphasizes that glucose, that's just the sidekick in this whole story. The critical insight here, the real game changer, is that insulin is the main character. High insulin levels, that's hyperinsulinemia, are the true early warning sign, appearing maybe years or even decades before your blood sugar gets high enough to signal diabetes. We've basically been defining the disease by its end stage, not its beginning.
That is a profound shift in perspective. Okay, so for people listening, what's the simplest way Dr. Bikman suggests they might even suspect they have IR, before thinking about lab tests?
Well, he provides a pretty straightforward self-assessment. Ask yourself these questions. Do you carry more fat around your belly specifically? Do you have high blood pressure? Is there a family history of heart disease? High blood triglycerides? Do you tend to retain water easily? Have you noticed patches of darker colored skin, maybe around your neck or armpits, or little skin bumps? That's acanthosis nigricans, or skin tags. Does a family member have IR or type 2 diabetes? And then for women, do you have polycystic ovarian syndrome, PCOS? For men, erectile dysfunction. He says if you answered yes to just one of those, you likely have some degree of IR. If you answered yes to two or more, it's highly probable you're dealing with insulin resistance. And if that's you, then this deep dive is definitely for you. And it's really crucial to grasp this. Insulin resistance itself isn't going to directly kill you. Instead, Dr. Bikman calls it a reliable vehicle for causing other, often life-threatening conditions. So what this means is that many seemingly unrelated health problems could actually be dramatically improved if we just address this one root cause.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, especially when we look at something huge like heart health. Heart disease is still the #1 killer globally, right? And the physician-scientist Joseph Kraft, he famously declared, those with cardiovascular disease not identified with diabetes, meaning insulin resistance, are simply undiagnosed. So in Dr. Bikman's view, the connection is almost, well, inseparable.
Let's break that down a bit. Starting with hypertension, high blood pressure, insulin actually tells your kidneys to hold on to salt and water by increasing a hormone called aldosterone. This directly boosts your blood volume and, pushes your blood pressure up. Dr. Bikman highlights that carbohydrates, because they spike insulin so much, can raise blood pressure, but dietary fat, interestingly, it doesn't have that effect. Plus, insulin resistance makes your blood vessels less responsive to nitric oxide, which they need to relax and, keep blood pressure normal.
And that connects to something else you mentioned, salt sensitivity. So if someone's blood pressure goes up with salt, They blame the salt.
Exactly. But what Dr. Bikman explains is that in that insulin-resistant state, the body's response to handle salt through that elevated aldosterone actually fights against insulin action. It makes the insulin resistance worse. It becomes this kind of vicious cycle.
Wow. Okay. What about cholesterol? Dyslipidemia, you called it.
Right, unhealthy cholesterol. But it's way more nuanced than just good HDL and bad LDL. LDL size turns out to be really important. Dr. Bikman explains that these smaller, denser LDL particles, they call it pattern B, are far more likely to cause problems because they can kind of sneak into your artery walls much more easily.
So how can you get a feel for your LDL size without needing some fancy, expensive test?
Well, he suggests what he calls the poor man's method. It's simple. Just divide your triglyceride number, TG, by your HDL number. If that ratio starts climbing above 2.0, it's a pretty good indicator you might have more of those harmful, small, dense pattern B particles. A ratio below 2.0 suggests more of the larger, fluffier, less harmful pattern A. It's a useful little check.
Okay, that's helpful. Now, what about statins? This was pretty startling in the book.
Yeah, it really is. Dr. Bikman points out that these drugs, which are so commonly prescribed to lower cholesterol, can actually increase the risk of getting type 2 diabetes, especially in postmenopausal women, by up to 50%. And he suggests this is because statins seem to promote insulin resistance directly by blocking the cell's ability to respond properly to insulin.
That's incredibly counterintuitive, isn't it, given how widespread their use is? So if statins can worsen IR, how does Bikman then link IR itself to atherosclerosis, the hardening of the arteries?
He explains it like this. Cholesterol getting deposited in blood vessel walls isn't necessarily bad initially, it's kind of benign, but it becomes noxious or harmful when it gets oxidized. Damaged, essentially. And Dr. Bikman identifies linoleic acid. This is a polyunsaturated fat that's super common in vegetable and seed oils, a huge part of the standard Western diet as a main culprit. Its chemical structure makes it really easy to oxidize, and once it's oxidized, it can kind of glom onto cholesterol, turning that previously harmless cholesterol into something that actually damages the artery wall.
And the heart discussion doesn't stop there. He also talks about cardiomyopathy.
Yes, basically, insulin resistance messes with the heart muscle's ability to take in and use glucose for fuel. This creates an energy shortage in the heart cells themselves, and he links this most strongly to dilated cardiomyopathy. That's where the heart muscle gets stretched thin and really struggles to pump blood effectively.
So what does this all mean for you listening? It means insulin resistance reaches far, far beyond just blood sugar and weight. I mean, just 20 years ago, the thinking was the brain didn't really respond to insulin. Now we know insulin is crucial for regulating lots of brain processes. And prolonged IR physically changes the brain. His research suggests for every 10 years you have IR, your brain literally looks 2 years older.
And Dr. Bikman highlights how Alzheimer's disease is even being called type 3 diabetes now. Insulin seems to directly increase the buildup of those amyloid beta plaques and also contribute to the neurofibrillary tangles, the twisted tau proteins seen in Alzheimer's. The core problem, he argues, is the brain just not getting enough glucose fuel. It's called glucose hypometabolism, caused by the brain's own insulin resistance. It's essentially running on empty.
And it doesn't stop with Alzheimer's, does it?
Not at all. He cites evidence linking IR to a doubled risk of vascular dementia. It impacts Parkinson's disease because insulin influences dopamine production, migraine headaches. Women with IR are twice as likely to suffer from regular migraines. And fascinatingly, medications that improve insulin sensitivity have been shown to reduce migraine frequency. Even the nerve-damaged neuropathy that often comes with diabetes is directly affected by IR. It's clear you need healthy insulin sensitivity for a healthy brain.
Okay, let's shift gears to something really personal for many, reproductive health. It seems clear we need insulin for healthy reproduction, but Bikman says too much from hyperinsulinemia and IR, or even too little, can lead to infertility.
Exactly. For women, think about pregnancy. It's naturally a state of mild physiological insulin resistance. That's normal. It helps the baby grow. But when IR becomes pathological, too severe, it leads to things like gestational diabetes, which, by the way, increases a woman's later risk of getting type 2 diabetes sevenfold. And severe IR also bumps up the risk of preeclampsia.
And polycystic ovarian syndrome, PCOS. That link seems incredibly strong.
It is. High insulin levels in women with PCOS mess with hormone balance. It inhibits an enzyme called aromatase. This leads to lower estrogen and higher androgens, causing those common PCOS symptoms like unwanted hair growth or male pattern hair loss. High insulin also directly causes those dark skin patches, acanthosis nigricans. But the good news is, controlling insulin often leads to more natural ovulation and makes fertility treatments work better.
What about men's fertility?
In men, insulin resistance is consistently linked to lower testosterone levels and significantly erectile dysfunction, or ED. He actually suggests ED could be one of the earliest signs of developing insulin resistance in younger men, which makes sense when you think about how vital insulin is for healthy blood vessel function, especially nitric oxide production needed for erections.
Wow. Even puberty isn't safe, it seems.
Right. Dr. Bikman points out that insulin, along with leptin from fat tissue, are key signals that trigger puberty. And this global overeating crisis, largely driven by easily digestible insulin-spiking carbohydrates, has contributed to a rise in precocious puberty starting earlier than normal. He cites data showing that for every 1 unit increase in BMI between ages 2 and 8, puberty tends to start about a month earlier. That's a pretty stark connection.
That really is.
And what's also fascinating, often overlooked, is that while we focus a lot on maternal health, he highlights evidence suggesting paternal insulin resistance might also influence the metabolic health of the children. It's potentially intergenerational.
Okay, moving beyond reproduction, let's talk about the link between insulin resistance and cancer. This is deeply concerning.
It really is. Cancer cells, by definition, grow excessively, right? And insulin is a powerful growth signal in the body. So elevated insulin levels, the kind you see constantly with IR, can dramatically accelerate cancer cell growth. This seems particularly true for breast, prostate, and colorectal cancers. Get this. Some breast cancer tumors can have 6 times more insulin receptors than normal, healthy breast tissue. They're essentially primed to respond to insulin's growth signals.
6 times.
And the reach of insulin resistance just keeps extending. It impacts so many other areas. Think about aging itself and various skin conditions, not just the dark patches and skin tags, but also things like psoriasis and acne seem linked. It affects our hearing conditions like age-related hearing loss, presbycusis, Meniere's disease, even tinnitus. One study found up to 92% of people with tinnitus had hyperinsulinemia. It contributes to muscle weakness, chronic fatigue, maybe even fibromyalgia. For bones and joints, it's weirdly paradoxical. IR can actually reduce bone strength, even if bone mass is okay, and it contributes to osteoarthritis and gout, partly by increasing uric acid.
Okay, keep going. This is comprehensive.
In the gastrointestinal tract, IR is linked to Barrett's esophagus. That's a precursor to esophageal cancer and also gastroparesis, where the stomach empties too slowly. And the liver. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, NAFLD. This was almost unheard of decades ago. Now it's the most common liver disorder in the West. Insulin resistance increases your risk of NAFLD by something like 15 times. He points a finger at fructose, found in tons of processed foods, saying it acts a lot like alcohol in the liver. He even mentions that certain gut bacteria can ferment glucose into alcohol, right in your gut, contributing to fatty liver. And then gallstones and even kidney failure are also strongly linked to IR. It touches almost everything.
All these diverse conditions really bring us to what's called a metabolic syndrome, right?
Yeah.
And its connection to obesity.
Exactly. Dr. Bikman explains metabolic syndrome is really just a cluster of problems. The core is insulin resistance, combined with any 2 other issues like high blood pressure, the unhealthy cholesterol pattern we talked about, extra belly fat, or protein in the urine. It actually used to be called insulin resistance syndrome, and it's incredibly common. About 1 in 3 U.S. adults has the full syndrome, but almost 90% have at least one feature.
Now, the big question, obesity and IR, which comes first? The chicken or the egg?
Yeah, that's the classic debate, and it's complicated. While we obviously associate excess body fat with IR, Dr. Bikman leans towards insulin often being the driver. He points to studies, for instance, showing that kids with the highest insulin levels were 36 times more likely to become obese adults, suggesting high insulin came first. His fundamental argument is that insulin is the critical factor. If insulin levels are chronically high, your body is basically locked in fat storage mode. Insulin tells cells to store fat and actively prevents fat from being released for energy. So high insulin fat gain, not necessarily the other way around, or at least insulin plays the primary role.
And you mentioned earlier, it matters where that fat is stored.
Absolutely. Visceral fat, that's the hard belly fat deep around your organs, is metabolically much more dangerous than subcutaneous fat, the softer, jiggly fat under the skin. Men tend to store more visceral fat, which contributes to more health problems. So, yeah. Don't curse the jiggly fat quite so much.
And the fat cells themselves change with IR.
Yes, they become sick. He describes hypertrophy, where you have fewer fat cells, but they get really large and become insulin resistant themselves. These big, sick fat cells tend to leak fat and inflammatory proteins into the bloodstream, causing problems elsewhere. This is different from hyperplasia, where you might have more fat cells, but they stay smaller and more insulin sensitive. That's healthier fat storage. This sickness seems driven by inflammation and harmful byproducts, especially from easily oxidized fats like linoleic acid from seed oils and molecules like ceramides. And then there's ectopic fat stored where it shouldn't be, like in the liver, pancreas, muscles. That also drives IR, often through those ceramides.
Okay, so we've covered the what and the why it matters. This raises the crucial question.
What actually causes us to become insulin resistant in the first place, beyond just the symptoms and the downstream effects?
Right. And according to Dr. Bikman, the single most relevant factor, simply too much insulin, too often.
Pretty much. His research suggests for every 1 micronit increase in your fasting blood insulin, your insulin resistance can go up by about 20%. It's like the body turning down the volume on a signal that's just constantly blaring. It dampens its response. He even mentions these fascinating, though rare, cases where accidental damage to a tiny part of the brain causes massive, constant insulin secretion, leading to profound IR almost immediately. Shows how powerful that insulin signal is.
Okay, so too much insulin is key. What about other factors? Age, genetics?
They definitely play a role, yeah. Children of insulin-resistant parents tend to have higher fasting insulin themselves, about 20% higher. And there's the old thrifty genotype idea that some populations evolve genes to store fat efficiently for survival. That might make them more susceptible in today's world of constant food access. But Dr. Bikman argues that the recent dramatic shift towards Western diets has had a much bigger impact on driving up IR rates globally than genetics alone. And yes, aging plays a part too. Hormonal changes like falling estrogen in menopausal women or lower testosterone in aging men tend to increase insulin resistance.
And stress. We hear a lot about stress impacting health.
Definitely. Both acute stress like having surgery and chronic stress like a demanding job or relationship issues, they both push insulin levels up. Cortisol, the main stress hormone, actively works against insulin and directly makes muscles insulin resistant.
Okay, what about inflammation? You mentioned inflammatory proteins from fat cells earlier.
Yeah, inflammation and oxidative stress are major players. Things like prolonged infections, mono, even chronic gum disease can trigger IR. And obesity itself, as Bikman describes it, is really a state of chronic low-grade inflammation. Those two big fat cells constantly leak inflammatory signals, creating those ceramides we mentioned, which actively interfere with insulin signaling. Even asthma, with its chronic inflammatory response, is highly linked to IR. And oxidative stress, basically damage from unstable molecules, often generated by our own energy production in mitochondria that also fuels insulin resistance.
It's a bit scary to think that things we just encounter every day, things we breathe and eat, could be making us insulin resistant too. Environmental toxins.
They certainly seem to contribute. He points to air pollution, specifically the fine particulate matter, PM2.5, from burning fuels. Breathing that in activates inflammatory pathways and leads to insulin resistance.
And smoking.
Oh yeah. Cigarette smoke is terrible for insulin sensitivity. It profoundly desensitizes the whole body. He highlights this really remarkable study from Bulgaria. Healthy non-smokers develop significant insulin resistance after just 3 days of smoking, only 4 cigarettes a day. And even secondhand smoke seems to induce those IR-causing ceramides.
Wow, 3 days. Okay, what about harmful things in our food?
Big category here. Fructose, not from whole fruit, but the kind added to roughly 70% of processed foods, even stuff marketed as healthy, is a major driver of IR, especially in the liver. Artificial sweeteners like aspartame, he notes they can trigger an insulin release almost identical to actual sugar in some people. MSG, monosodium glutamate, has been linked to metabolic syndrome. And then there are industrial chemicals, bisphenol A, BPA from plastics, persistent organic pollutants, POPs from pesticides. These act as endocrine disruptors and can directly promote IR.
It's an incredible number of factors. You even mentioned salt sensitivity earlier.
Right. For some people, excess salt drives up blood pressure. And in that insulin-resistant state, the body's attempt to manage salt via aldosterone ends up worsening the insulin resistance. And sort of counterintuitively, severe or prolonged calorie restriction, like with anorexia, can also cause insulin resistance. It does this by jacking up stress hormones like cortisol and lowering thyroid function. The body goes into a kind of self-preservation, insulin-sparing mode.
Okay, so external factors, internal factors. What about our lifestyle choices? things we do day to day.
These are huge. Sleep is critical. Not getting enough sleep makes you significantly more insulin resistant and quickly. Just 1 week of reduced sleep can make the body about 30% more insulin resistant. Even just 2 nights of poor sleep can make healthy young men temporarily insulin resistant. And exposure to bright light at night, especially blue light from screens, that messes with melatonin and cortisol and makes the sleep deprivation effects even worse for IR. Interestingly, he also mentions that napping too much, like over an hour regularly, is linked to IR, whereas short power naps, under 30 minutes, might actually be beneficial.
Fascinating. And the big one, probably, lack of movement, sedentary living.
Absolutely. The old saying, use it or lose it, applies perfectly here. Physical inactivity is a direct cause of insulin resistance. He references a study showing just 1 week of being sedentary can increase insulin resistance sevenfold in 1 week. This primarily hits the muscles that aren't being used, and it seems to work through hijacking inflammatory pathways within the muscle itself.
Okay, so we've laid out the problem, the connections, the causes.
Yeah.
It might sound a bit bleak, but what does this all mean for you listening? The really exciting part, the part Dr. Bikman emphasizes heavily, is that insulin resistance is not a one-way street. It can be prevented, and often it can even be reversed through actionable lifestyle strategies.
Yes, and the power of movement is absolutely key here. Any physical activity helps combat IR. Why? Because working muscles can actually pull glucose out of the bloodstream without needing insulin to unlock the door. This naturally helps lower insulin levels both during and after exercise. And he stresses that exercise improves insulin sensitivity even if you don't lose any weight. It specifically targets visceral fat, reduces inflammation, and cuts down oxidative stress.
So what are some practical tips for listeners who want to get moving? What does Bikman suggest?
Well, he points out that while pretty much any exercise is good, resistance training, lifting weights, body weight exercises might give you the most bang for your buck in terms of improving insulin sensitivity per minute spent. But his ultimate advice, which I think is great, is that the best exercise is the one you will actually do. Consistency is key. He suggests aiming for activity maybe 6 days a week for 20 to 40 minutes per session. And intensity seems to matter more than just duration. So things like high-intensity interval training, HIIT for cardio, or training to failure, meaning until you can't do another rep with good form for resistance work. And he makes a point to say resistance training is for everyone, including women who might worry about bulking up. That's largely a myth unless you're training specifically for it.
Okay, that's helpful. Movement is key. What else? You mentioned something surprising earlier, cold exposure.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Regularly exposing yourself to cold doesn't have to be ice baths. Could just be a cooler room, or less bundling up can activate brown adipose tissue, or BAT, brown fat. Unlike regular white fat that just stores energy, brown fat is packed with mitochondria, and its job is to burn fuel glucose and fat to generate heat. So activating it literally helps you burn off excess glucose and lower insulin levels. Cold exposure also boosts adiponectin, a hormone that's really beneficial for insulin sensitivity.
Interesting. Okay, but the real core of the solution, according to Bikman, seems to be eating smart, right? Let's unpack that.
Absolutely. He argues really strongly for focusing on the type of calories you eat, much more than just the number of calories, because different macronutrients, carbs, fats, proteins have vastly different effects on our hormones, especially insulin.
And his main focus is on carbohydrates.
It is. He presents really compelling evidence from clinical research going back to the 90s, showing that restricting carbohydrates is a powerful way to prevent or significantly improve insulin resistance. Study after study, he cites, shows that low-carb diets lead to greater weight loss, sure, but more importantly, significantly lower insulin levels and better improvements in IR markers compared to traditional low-fat diets, even when calories aren't restricted. One study he mentions found a low-carb diet dropped insulin levels by 50% compared to only 15% on a low-fat diet. And in that same study, almost half the participants with type 2 diabetes were able to get off their insulin medication completely just by changing their diet.
Wow. 50% drop in insulin, getting off meds.
Yeah.
That's huge. And it's not just about cutting all carbs, is it? He talks about carb quality, too.
Right. Not all carbs are created equal. He suggests using the glycemic load, GL, as a rough guide. It estimates how much a particular food serving will likely raise your blood glucose and, consequently, your insulin. The advice is pretty simple. Choose whole, high-nutrient, lower GL vegetables and fruits. And he offers a neat trick. If you're going to eat starchy carbs, try eating them after you've eaten your protein and vegetables in the meal. This can significantly blunt the blood glucose and insulin spike. Soluble fiber, especially the kind found in certain fruits and veggies, also helps slow down glucose absorption and is beneficial.
Okay, so be smart about carbs. What about fats? Fat has been demonized for so long.
Yeah, and he really pushes back on that. The truth about fats, as he explains it, is often misunderstood. The real problem often isn't the fat you eat, but specific types of fats, like those ceramides that your cells make internally, often in response to inflammation and excess energy. He emphasizes that well-formulated carb-restricted diets, which are naturally higher in fat, do not increase harmful ceramides or saturated fat levels in the blood. In fact, the opposite often happens. He cites studies where low-carb groups ate 3 times more saturated fat than low-fat groups, yet they had a bigger drop in fasting insulin and a reduction in saturated fat circulating in their blood. Some saturated fats, like from butter or lard, might even reduce blood fats more effectively than some unsaturated fats. His main caution on fats is really against the highly processed, industrially produced polyunsaturated fats, the vegetable and seed oils like corn, soy, canola oil, etc., because they are so prone to oxidation. But he does note that some polyunsaturated fats, like alpha-linolenic acid and omega-3 from flax seeds, can actually improve insulin sensitivity.
Okay, so fat isn't the enemy, but processed seed oils are suspect. What about ketones? He talks about those too.
Yes, the power of ketones. They used to be dismissed as just metabolic garbage, waste products of fat burning. But now we know they're actually a perfectly good fuel source for almost every cell in the body, including the brain and muscles, especially when glucose is scarce. And beyond fuel, they also act as important signaling molecules with potent antioxidant and anti-inflammatory effects. Dr. Bikman also highlights research suggesting that when you're in a state of nutritional ketosis, where your body is making ketones for fuel, your metabolic rate actually increases by about 100 to 300 calories per day compared to eating a high-carb diet. A little metabolic advantage.
Interesting. So carb quality, fat quality, ketones. What about when we eat? Meal timing.
Another powerful lever, and one that's often overlooked. He points out that most people in modern society eat far too frequently, constantly stimulating insulin. He advocates for strategies like intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding where you compress your eating into a smaller window each day, or maybe fast for a full day periodically as really effective tools to lower overall insulin exposure and improve sensitivity.
And he has that fascinating insight about breakfast and the dawn phenomena.
Right. Your body naturally becomes slightly more insulin resistant around 5:30 a.m. It's a normal hormonal surge involving cortisol to help you wake up. But if you then eat a typical high-carb, sugary breakfast cereal, toast, juice during this naturally resistant time, your body has to pump out even more insulin to handle it. So Dr. Bikman suggests maybe considering skipping breakfast altogether, or at least choosing a breakfast that's very low in carbs and higher in protein and healthy fats. And interestingly, he notes your fat tissue is actually more insulin sensitive in the morning. So hitting it with a big insulin spike from a carb-heavy breakfast might be particularly effective at promoting fat storage then.
Okay, timing matters. What about fermented foods?
Yes, he's a fan. Things like raw apple cider vinegar, real sourdough bread where the fermentation breaks down some carbs, kimchi, sauerkraut, plain yogurt, kefir. The fermentation process often involves bacteria consuming some of the sugars, which lowers the food's impact on your blood glucose and insulin. Plus, these foods deliver beneficial probiotic bacteria, which themselves seem to improve insulin sensitivity through gut health mechanisms.
So pulling this together, what are some practical insulin-friendly food choices he recommends?
Generally focus on whole, unprocessed foods. Animal products, meats, fish, poultry, eggs are great sources of protein and typically very low carb. For vegetarians, the focus should be on less starchy plant foods, higher fat plant foods. Think fruit fats like avocado, olives, coconut, and definitely avoid those seed oils. Dairy. Choose fermented options or higher fat versions like cheese, plain Greek yogurt, heavy cream, rather than low-fat milk which still has sugar, lactose. For added fats, prioritize saturated and monounsaturated fats from animal sources, butter, tallow, and fruit sources, olive oil, avocado oil, coconut oil. Again, steer clear of the polyunsaturated seed oils. Nuts. Go for lower carb options like macadamia nuts, pecans, Brazil nuts over cashews or pistachios.
What about micronutrients, vitamins, minerals?
While the macronutrient balance is definitely the main focus for impacting insulin, he does note that certain micronutrients seem particularly important for insulin sensitivity. Magnesium, vitamin D, and zinc are the main ones he highlights as having positive effects shown in research.
Okay. He also includes a couple of warnings, right, about shakes and social pressure.
He does. Be wary of conventional meal replacement shakes. Many are loaded with refined carbs and those problematic seed oils, even if marketed for weight loss or health. Read the labels carefully. And yeah, the social aspect. He notes, somewhat humorously but also seriously, that when you decide to cut back on sugar and processed carbs, you might face resistance from friends or family. They might tease you, question you, maybe even deliberately sabotage your efforts, perhaps unintentionally. It's something to be prepared for when making lifestyle changes.
Good point. Finally, on solutions, he briefly touches on conventional medical interventions.
Yes, just briefly. He acknowledges that for severe cases, there are drugs like metformin or the newer gliflozin class, which work in different ways to improve insulin sensitivity or glucose handling. And bariatric surgery is an option for significant obesity. However, he emphasizes that these often come with side effects, and crucially, they might not fix the underlying insulin resistance permanently if the diet and lifestyle factors that caused it aren't also addressed. Weight regain after surgery, for instance, is common if eating habits don't change long-term. Diet and exercise remain the foundational tools.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. For someone listening now, feeling maybe a bit overwhelmed but also motivated, where do you actually start? What's the plan?
Right, putting research into action. The very first step, Dr. Bikman urges, is simply to know your starting point. Assess where you are.
How do you do that reliably? Beyond just the symptom quiz.
Ideally, get your insulin levels measured. This usually requires a lab blood test ordered by a doctor. Ask for fasting insulin. He suggests aiming for a fasting insulin level ideally less than about 6 microunits per milliliter, OMML. Higher levels suggest increasing resistance. He also mentions the HOME-IR score. It's a calculation using your fasting glucose and fasting insulin. A score over 1.5 generally indicates IR. An even better test, though less common, is an oral glucose tolerance test, OGTT, with insulin measurements. If your insulin level peaks late, say at 60 minutes or even later after drinking the glucose drink, that's a strong sign of IR. Healthy insulin should peak early and come down quickly. Now, if getting a blood test isn't easy or accessible right away, you can still track progress indirectly. As your insulin sensitivity improves, your blood pressure should naturally start to come down, or if you're following a lower carb approach, you could monitor ketones using urine strips or a blood meter. As insulin drops, ketone levels should rise, indicating your body is burning fat more effectively.
Okay, so step 1, assess. Step 2, exercise.
Yes, exercise to boost that insulin sensitivity. And remember, don't feel intimidated. His key advice, the best exercise, is the one you will actually do. Find something you can stick with. A good goal is a balanced mix of aerobic activity and resistance training. Aim for maybe 6 days a week, 20-40 minutes a session, and focus on intensity. Think interval training for cardio or lifting weights to the point of fatigue. That seems to give the best results for improving insulin function.
And step 3, the personalized eating plan. This sounds like the biggest shift for most people.
It probably is, yes. And there's no single perfect diet for everyone. But the general principle for tackling IR, based on Bikman's work, is that carbohydrates will likely need to become a much smaller part of your diet than the typical Western pattern. How small depends on how insulin resistant you are. The more resistant, the more cautious you likely need to be with carbs. Remember his simple rules. Don't be so sweet, meaning drastically cut added sugars and refined sweets. Be starch smart. Avoid processed, refined grains and starchy foods like bread, pasta, white rice, potatoes, especially early in the process. And don't drink your carbohydrates. Ditch the sugary drinks, sodas, fruit juices. Eat the whole fruit instead, in moderation. Try to incorporate some fermented foods daily, and embrace healthy fats from animal sources and fruits like avocados, olives, coconuts. Don't fear fat, fear the wrong kinds of carbs and fats.
Can you give some simple meal ideas based on that?
Sure. Think things like a big taco salad, lots of greens, seasoned meat, cheese, salsa, avocado, sour cream. Just skip the fried shell or chips. Or grilled salmon with roasted broccoli or asparagus drizzled with olive oil. Maybe chicken stir-fry with lots of non-starchy veggies and a tamari-based sauce served over cauliflower rice instead of white rice. Even comfort food remakes like cauliflower mac and cheese using a real cheese sauce. Desserts. Bikman suggests using non-caloric sweeteners like stevia or erythritol if you need something sweet, but really, keep desserts as an occasional treat, not a daily thing.
That makes sense. Simple swaps, focus on whole foods.
Exactly. And Dr. Bikman's ultimate message throughout the book is really this. It's time to let the scientific data, not outdated dogma or industry influence, guide our health decisions.
So, recapping our deep dive today. We've explored Dr. Benjamin Bikman's groundbreaking work on insulin resistance. We've unpacked its truly profound impact on nearly every aspect of your health, from your heart to your brain to your waistline. We've exposed some of the surprising and often hidden causes things in our food, our environment, our daily habits. And most importantly, we've hopefully empowered you with actionable solutions grounded in science to start fighting back against this silent epidemic.
Absolutely. And Dr. Bikman's final urging is clear. Don't wait for a diagnosis like diabetes or heart disease to show up. Don't wait until things are bad. Do something now. Even a small change can start the ball rolling. Maybe start by just changing what you eat for breakfast tomorrow morning. Try to get your insulin level checked if you can. And find a way to get moving regularly, even if it's just a brisk walk.
Fight the resistance. Dr. Bikman really emphasizes that your lifestyle encompassing your unique strengths, weaknesses, your genes, your environment, your choices, is a massive part of what got you to where you are metabolically. And the good news is that same lifestyle, if you approach it intentionally based on this understanding of insulin, can absolutely be the key to getting you where you want to be health-wise.
It really shifts the focus, doesn't it? And maybe a final provocative thought to leave listeners with. If we truly start recognizing insulin, not just as a blood sugar hormone, but as the central conductor of our entire metabolic orchestra, as Bikman suggests, what new possibilities might emerge for our collective health? If we focused on fixing insulin sensitivity upstream, instead of just managing the downstream symptoms like high blood sugar or high cholesterol, what could that mean for preventing chronic disease on a larger scale? It really challenges us to rethink our whole approach.